Chapter 1: Winter is coming. The sun peeked through the golden autumn leaves, casting warm patches of light across the forest floor. A cool breeze rustled the branches, shaking loose acorns that tumbled down with soft little plops. High up in the tallest oak tree, a fuzzy little squirrel stretched his paws and yawned. "Oh, what a beautiful morning," he said, rubbing the sleep from his eyes. This wasn't just any squirrel. This was Silly Squirrel, the silliest, bounciest, most snack-loving squirrel in the whole forest. And today was an important day. He fluffed his tail, grabbed his knapsack, and looked out over the treetops. Winter is coming, and I need snacks. Lots and lots of snacks. No naps. And I love naps. Silly Squirrel had spent too much time playing and not enough time preparing for winter. His cozy treehouse had a soft bed and a warm fireplace, but it was completely empty of food. Oh no, what if it snows tomorrow? What if my tummy rumbles all winter long? He gasped dramatically. I must find nuts, acorns, peanuts, chestnuts, hazelnuts, as many as I can carry. He zipped down the tree in a swirl of fluffy fur, landing with a soft thump on the ground. His first stop? The big pond, where he had seen the shiniest walnut in the whole forest just the day before. Silly Squirrel took a deep breath and set off on his adventure. His great nut hunt had begun. Chapter 2. The floating walnut Silly Squirrel scampered through the forest, his fluffy tail bouncing behind him. He was on a mission. The first nut he needed to find was a big, shiny walnut he had seen near the pond the day before. "Ooh, a walnut is a perfect start. Crunchy, tasty, and oh so delicious," he said, licking his lips. But when he reached the pond, he stopped in his tracks. His eyes grew wide. The walnut was floating in the middle of the water. Silly Squirrel's ears drooped. Oh, no. Walnuts aren't supposed to float. They're supposed to sit nicely on the ground where I can grab them. He paced back and forth, tapping his chin. I can't swim. How will I ever reach it? Just then, plip, plop, something splashed nearby. Ribbit, who's making all that fuss? Silly Squirrel turned to see Timmy the Toad, sitting on a lily pad, blinking his big round eyes. Oh, Timmy, I need that walnut, but it's floating away. Silly Squirrel pointed dramatically at the nut, which was now drifting even farther from the shore. Timmy scratched his bumpy head. Well, I can swim, but I don't think I can carry a big ol' walnut. Silly Squirrel's tail drooped. Then what do I do? Timmy thought for a moment, then his eyes lit up. I know. You can hop across the lily pads, just like me. Silly Squirrel's eyes widened. Hop? But I don't have froggy legs. You don't need froggy legs, said Timmy with a grin. You just need to be brave and bounce. Watch me. Timmy took a giant leap onto the nearest lily pad. Splat! He landed perfectly. Silly Squirrel gulped. Okay, here goes nothing. He wiggled his fluffy tail, bent his knees, and boing! He landed on the first lily pad. It wobbled, but he stayed on. Whee! This is kind of fun. He bounced to the next one, then the next, then splash! His foot slipped and his tail dipped into the cold water. Eek! Wet tail, he squeaked, shaking it off. Timmy giggled. You're almost there. One more hop. Silly Squirrel took a deep breath and leaped as high as he could. Plop! He landed right on top of the walnut. Hooray! I got it! He cheered, holding the nut above his head. And it's even shinier up close, Timmy laughed. See? All you needed was a little bounce. Silly Squirrel carefully hopped back to shore, shaking off his damp paws. He dropped the walnut into his knapsack and gave Timmy a big grin. Thanks, Timmy. I never knew I could hop like a toad. Ribbit, anytime, Squirrel. Good luck finding more nuts. With his first nut safely tucked away, Silly Squirrel waved goodbye and scampered off toward his next challenge. His great nut hunt was far from over. Chapter 3. The tricky chestnut Silly Squirrel hopped along the forest path, his knapsack bouncing against his back. One walnut down, lots more to go, he said happily. But as he walked, he noticed something strange. His bag felt a little heavier. He wiggled his shoulders. He hopped up and down. He even twirled in a circle. Hoo boy, this bag is already getting heavy, and I've only got one nut. But Silly Squirrel wasn't going to quit. He fluffed his tail, took a deep breath, and kept going. His next stop? A big hollow log in the middle of the forest. Silly Squirrel had seen a shiny brown chestnut roll inside the log the day before. If he could just reach in and grab it, he'd have another tasty treat for winter. He skidded to a stop in front of the log and peeked inside. There it was, the chestnut, round, smooth, and perfect. but it was way, way, way down at the bottom. Silly Squirrel reached his paw inside. He stretched and stretched, but his little paw was too short. Oh, fluffy whiskers, how am I supposed to get it now? Just then he heard a crunch, crackle, chomp! Silly Squirrel jumped and spun around. It was Benny the Beaver. He was sitting by the riverbank chewing on a big fat stick. "Hey there, Silly Squirrel," Benny said between bites. "What's got your tail in a twist?" Silly Squirrel pointed to the log. "There's a chestnut in there, but it's stuck at the bottom. My paws aren't long enough to reach it." Benny chuckled and tapped his big teeth. "Well, you know what I always say, if you can't reach it, roll it." Silly Squirrel blinked. "Roll it?" "Yep, logs roll, you know. Just gotta give it a good push." Benny grinned. Silly Squirrel squinted at the log, then he puffed out his chest. "All right, let's roll." Benny and Silly Squirrel stood side by side. 1, 2, 3. They pushed the log with all their might. It wiggled. They pushed again. It shook. They pushed one more time, and whoosh! The log rolled over. The chestnut popped right out. Silly Squirrel dove forward and grabbed it. "Ha! Got it!" Benny laughed and clapped. "See, sometimes you just gotta think outside the log." Silly Squirrel dropped the chestnut into his knapsack, which now felt even heavier. "Whoa, this bag is getting really full," he said, wiggling his shoulders again. "But I still have more nuts to find," Benny grinned. "Good luck, buddy. And if you ever need help rolling something again, you know where to find me." Silly Squirrel waved goodbye and trotted off toward his next nut. Chapter 4, The High-Flying Acorn. Silly Squirrel huffed and puffed as he walked through the forest, his knapsack bouncing behind him. 2 nuts down, a few more to go. But whoa, this bag is getting so heavy, he said, shaking his little shoulders. Maybe I should have packed a snack to give me energy. Oh wait, I'm collecting snacks. Silly me. He giggled to himself and kept moving. His next stop, the tallest oak tree in the whole forest. Way up at the top, Silly Squirrel had spotted the biggest, most golden acorn he had ever seen. But there was just one little problem. "It's way too high," he said, craning his neck to look up. "I don't think I can climb that far without getting dizzy." Just then a soft hoot echoed through the trees. Hoo-hoo! Who's talking to themselves down there? Silly Squirrel spun around and saw Olive the Owl sitting on a branch above him. "Oh, Olive, it's me! I need to get that acorn, but it's way, way up in the tree." Olive blinked her big eyes and fluffed her feathers. "Well, climbing is what squirrels do best. What's the problem?" Silly Squirrel fidgeted with his paws. I kind of maybe get a little scared when I climb too high." Olive nodded. "Ah, I see. That's called being careful, but don't worry, I have a trick that might help." Silly Squirrel's ears perked up. "A trick?" "Yes! Flap your arms like wings. It helps with balance." Olive spread her wings and gave a little flap. "And if you flap and hoot at the same time, it's even more fun." Silly Squirrel tilted his head. "Flap and hoot? Like this?" He wiggled his paws and hooted softly. "Hoo-hoo, look at me, I'm a squirrel owl." Olive chuckled. "Almost. Now try climbing while you do it." Silly Squirrel took a deep breath and started climbing. One branch, flap, flap, hoo-hoo. Another branch, wiggle, flap, hoo-hoo. Higher and higher he climbed. "Hey, this is actually working," he giggled. "I feel so balanced." Finally, he reached the golden acorn. "Gotcha!" he cheered, grabbing it and stuffing it into his knapsack. But just as he started climbing back down, crack! The tiny branch under his paw snapped. "Eep, peep!" Silly Squirrel wobbled. He flapped his arms as fast as he flap, flap! Instead of falling, he floated gently down, landing in a pile of soft leaves. "Oof! Ha ha! That was kind of fun," he said, shaking the leaves off his fur. Olive swooped down next to him. "See? Flapping helps. And you faced your fear of climbing high." Silly Squirrel grinned. "I guess I did. Thanks, Olive. You're the best." Olive gave a wise little nod. "Anytime, little flapper. Good luck with your nut hunt." With his third nut safely in his knapsack, Silly Squirrel waved goodbye and scampered off to his next adventure. Chapter 5, The Buried Peanut. Silly Squirrel trotted along the forest path, his knapsack bouncing heavily behind him. 3 nuts down, just a few more to go, but goodness, this bag is getting heavy. He wiggled his shoulders, hopped up and down, and even shook his fluffy tail to see if it would help. Nope, still heavy. But a squirrel's gotta do what a squirrel's gotta do. His next stop, a sunny meadow where he had seen a peanut half buried in the dirt. As he reached the meadow, Silly Squirrel's nose twitched. "Sniff, sniff! I smell something nutty," he said, bouncing excitedly. That peanut is close. I just know it. He scampered forward and screeched to a stop. Right there, half hidden in the dirt, was the biggest peanut he had ever seen. Silly Squirrel rubbed his paws together. A little digging and this baby's mine. He scooped at the dirt. He scratched and scratched. He dug and thud! His tiny claws hit something hard. The peanut was stuck. Oh, fluff! He groaned. It's buried too deep. How will I ever get it out? Just then, thump! 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 The ground shook beneath him. Silly Squirrel's ears perked up. He turned to see Daisy the deer. She trotted over gracefully, her big, gentle eyes blinking in the sunlight. "Hello, Silly Squirrel. What's all the fuss?" Silly Squirrel pointed at the peanut. "It's stuck. I've been digging and digging, but it won't budge." Daisy tilted her head. "Oh, I see. Maybe I can help." Silly Squirrel scratched his head. "You know how to dig," Daisy giggled. "Not exactly, but I do know how to stomp." She lifted her front hoof and gently tapped the ground. Silly Squirrel blinked. "That's it. That's not gonna." Thump! Daisy stomped again, just a little harder. Rumble! The ground shook just enough to loosen the peanut. It popped right out. "Whoa!" Silly Squirrel leaped forward and grabbed it. "That was amazing! You stomped the ground and made the peanut pop right up." Daisy smiled. "Sometimes all you need is a little shake to set things free." Silly Squirrel tossed the peanut into his knapsack, which was now very full. "Whoa! This bag is getting ridiculous," he huffed, trying to adjust the straps. Daisy giggled. "Well, I hope you find a way to carry all those nuts. Good luck, Silly Squirrel." Silly Squirrel waved goodbye and scurried off, feeling happy and proud. Chapter 6: The Windy Hazelnut. Silly Squirrel waddled along the forest path, his knapsack now bulging with nuts and bouncing behind him. "Oh boy," he groaned. "This bag is getting really heavy. My poor little squirrel shoulders." He wiggled, he stretched, he even tried walking backward. Nope, still heavy. But Silly Squirrel was determined. He had one last nut to find before heading home. His next stop? The top of Windy Hill, where he had spotted a big round hazelnut the day before. As he reached the hill, a strong gust of wind rushed past, ruffling his fur. "Brrr! Chilly, but nothing can stop me now," he said, fluffing his tail for warmth. Then he saw it. Right at the top of the hill sat the biggest, roundest hazelnut ever. It was just sitting there, waiting to be taken. Silly Squirrel grinned. "Easy peasy," he said, trotting toward it. But just as he reached for the nut, whoosh! A strong gust of wind blew the hazelnut right down the hill. "Ah, my nut!" Silly Squirrel shrieked. He dashed after it, running as fast as his tiny legs could go. The nut zigged, the nut zagged, Silly Squirrel zigged and zagged right behind it. But just as he was about to grab it, whoosh! Another gust sent the nut rolling even faster. Then out of nowhere, zoom! A flash of orange fur sped past Silly Squirrel. It was Freddie the Fox. "Hey there, Silly, what's the hurry?" Freddie called, trotting beside him. "My hazelnut, it's getting away!" Silly Squirrel panted. Freddie squinted ahead. "Ooh, a rolling game! I love rolling games." "This is not a game. This is a squirrel emergency," Silly Squirrel wailed. Freddie chuckled. "Relax, buddy. I've got a trick for catching things that roll." Silly Squirrel perked up. "You do? What is it? Tell me, tell me." Freddie grinned. "You gotta slide, not run." "Slide?" Silly Squirrel blinked. "Yup. Just plop onto your belly and let the hill do the work. Watch this." Freddie leaped forward and flopped onto his belly. With a wiggle of his tail, he started sliding smoothly down the hill, his paws tucked in like a little orange sled. "Way! Fox to the rescue!" Freddie called as he zoomed toward the hazelnut. Silly Squirrel watched in amazement. Then he gritted his teeth. "All right, here goes nothing." He took a big breath, jumped onto his belly, and swoosh! He was sliding. "Whoa, whoa, whoa! This is amazing!" he squealed, zipping down the hill like a little furry sled. Freddie reached out a paw. Swipe! He grabbed the nut just before it could roll into the bushes. Silly Squirrel skidded to a stop, tumbling right into Freddie with a thump. They both burst out laughing. "That was wild," Silly Squirrel said, shaking the leaves out of his fur. Freddie grinned. "Told ya, sliding is way faster than running." Silly Squirrel tossed the hazelnut into his knapsack, which was now impossibly full. "Oh boy, I don't think I can carry this bag one more step," he groaned. Freddie smirked. "Good luck with that, Silly. Maybe you need another trick to get it all home." Silly Squirrel nodded slowly, realizing he had one last big challenge left. How was he going to get all this food back to his tree? Chapter 7: The Big Problem. Too many nuts. Silly Squirrel stood at the bottom of the hill, staring at his stuffed, bulging knapsack. It was so full, the seams were stretching and nuts were poking out the top. He gave it a tiny tug. It didn't budge. He pulled harder. It wiggled a little. Then he yanked with all his might. Whump! He fell backward, landing flat on his fluffy tail. Oof, this is impossible. My knapsack is too heavy, he groaned, rubbing his head. Freddy the Fox chuckled. Told ya, silly. You need a better way to carry all that food home. Silly Squirrel crossed his arms. But how? I can't carry it. I can't drag it. And I definitely can't eat it all now. He plopped onto the ground, thinking as hard as his little squirrel brain could. Just then, plip! Plop! Timmy the Toad bounced up, his bumpy skin glistening in the sunlight. Ribbit? What's wrong, Squirrel? He asked. My bag is too heavy. I can't carry it home. Timmy tapped his chin. Maybe we need more help. Before Silly Squirrel could answer, crunch! Chomp! Benny the Beaver waddled over, gnawing on a stick. Hey there, friends! What's all the chatter? Silly Squirrel sighed. My knapsack is too heavy. I can't take another step. Benny grinned. Well, if it's too heavy to carry, maybe we should roll it home. Silly Squirrel's ears perked up. Roll it? Sure, let's find something to push it on. At that moment, clip-clop. Daisy the deer trotted into the clearing, her big brown eyes curious. What's going on? She asked. Benny explained the problem. Daisy nodded and tapped her hoof. I can help. I can carry the knapsack on my back. Silly Squirrel gasped. That's a great idea. But wait, said Timmy. How will we keep all the nuts inside? Just then, whoosh! Olive the Owl swooped down, landing gracefully on a branch. I heard a problem needs solving, she hooted. Silly Squirrel jumped up. Yes, we need to keep my knapsack closed while Daisy carries it. Olive fluffed her feathers. I can help. I'll tie the top with some vines. Silly Squirrel clapped his paws. Yes, yes, this might actually work. Timmy hopped ahead, scanning the path for any big rocks or holes. Ribbit, no tripping allowed on my watch, he said, clearing away twigs. Benny chewed through some thick branches, rolling them into place to create a small sled. There, this will help balance the bag on Daisy's back, he said proudly. Daisy stood tall, letting Benny and Silly Squirrel carefully lift the knapsack onto her back. She wobbled a little, then steadied herself. It's heavy, but I can do it, she said with a smile. Olive flew in circles above them, weaving long, strong vines together. She swooped down and wrapped them tightly around the knapsack, making sure no nuts would spill out. Hoot, hoot, nice and snug, she said proudly. Freddy trotted beside Daisy, keeping an eye on the bag. If anything falls, I'll be on nut patrol, he grinned. Silly Squirrel bounced excitedly. This is amazing! I have the best friends ever! Daisy took her first careful steps. The knapsack wobbled, but the vines held tight. Slowly but surely, the group made their way through the forest. They walked over twigs, hopped over puddles, and carefully tiptoed past a sleeping bear who snored very loudly. Silly Squirrel couldn't believe it. We're almost home, he cheered. Finally, after one last hill, they reached Silly Squirrel's tree. Daisy knelt down carefully, and Benny helped slide the knapsack off her back. With a big tumble and a soft thud, all the nuts rolled right into Silly Squirrel's storage hole. Silly Squirrel jumped up and down. It worked! I have all my nuts! Winter snacks are saved! He turned to his friends, his heart feeling warm and full. Thank you, everyone. I couldn't have done it without you. Olive nodded wisely. That's what friends are for, Daisy smiled, and teamwork makes everything easier. Silly Squirrel grinned. I'll never forget this, and next year, I'm starting my nut hunt early. His friends laughed, and together they all shared one last happy hug before heading home. Chapter 8. Cozy Winter Ahead. As the sun began to set, Silly Squirrel stood proudly outside his tree, gazing at the giant pile of nuts inside his storage hole. I did it! I really did it, he said with a happy sigh. His knapsack was finally empty, his little paws were tired, and his fluffy tail drooped from all the running, hopping, sliding, and thinking he had done that day. But his heart was full. He turned to his friends, who stood nearby, watching him with big smiles. You all helped me so much, he said, his voice warm and grateful. I never would have made it home with all my nuts without you. Daisy gave a soft nuzzle. That's what friends are for, silly. Timmy hopped up and down. Ribbit, and now you have enough food for the whole winter. Benny nodded. No more last-minute nut hunting next time, okay? He teased. Olive fluffed her feathers. And you learned something important. It's okay to ask for help. Freddy grinned. And let's not forget, sliding is way more fun than running. Silly Squirrel laughed. You're right, I learned so much today. He gathered all his friends in one big squirrel-sized group hug. Thank you, thank you, thank you, he said, his fluffy tail swishing happily. His friends waved goodbye as they headed home, disappearing into the trees. Now it was time for Silly Squirrel to get cozy and enjoy the winter.